I want to give thanks to our Social Justice Education Curriculum Committee and our Diversity Committee under the leadership of Dr. Forrester, Dr. Hackman, and Dr. Anna Zera for making this event possible. Dr. Arthur Stewart is a Senior Associate Dean for the Community Health Engagement at University of Tennessee Health Science Center in Memphis, Director for the Division of Public and Community Psychiatry, and Director for the Center for Youth Advocacy and Wellbeing. Prior to joining University of Tennessee, she served for decades as the CEO, Executive Director in large public mental health systems in Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan. Her early beginnings is an unlikely one that reads like a historical account of the experiences of African Americans during the mid to late 20th century. And she has deemed her journey specializing in the wholly impossible. All along the way in her career, she has been prejudged based on her color, her skin color, her gender, her age, and her Southern origins. We share those Southern origins, and I'm very proud to have those Southern roots. Alta is a true Memphian. She's truly from Memphis, who grew up in a two-parent working class family in South Memphis during the 1950s. She and her family lived through the unspeakable realities of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, before Brown versus the Board of Education. She also lived through the pain of the assassination of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., PhD, from a frighteningly close vantage point in her home city of Memphis. Her experiences of blatant and pervasive societal and personal racism, and at times sexism, were redeemed only by a series of teachers and mentors in her years of schooling who took Alta under their wings and provided just enough protection to deliver her with all of her talents, from public school to a parochial high school, and then to Christian Brothers University, where she would graduate first in her class. With a love of science, a fearless attitude, and a spirit of compassion, she received her medical degree from Temple University Medical School and completed her residency at what is now Drexel University. She has received honorary degrees from Regis College and Christian Brothers University, and is an honorary member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists. No challenge has proved too great for Dr. Alta Stewart, and she has done the wholly impossible, including becoming the first African-American president of the world's largest psychiatric organization in the world. Dr. Alta Stewart became the first African-American president 173 years after its founding. She is currently the president of the American Association of Community Psychiatry and also the past president of the Black Psychiatrists of America, the Association of Women Psychiatrists, and the American Psychiatric Foundation. She was recently awarded the 2002 Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Party's Humanitarian Award and is the recipient of the Black Psychiatrists of America Lifetime Achievement Award and the American Psychiatric Association Psychiatric Administration and Leadership Administrative Psychiatry Award, and numerous awards, including the APA Solomon Carter Fuller Award and the Alexandria Simmons Awards. Truly, she has been awarded many, many, many awards. She is also a contributor of the Textbook of Community Psychiatry and Psychiatry Clinics of North America volumes on the workforce and professional diversity in psychiatry. She currently serves as a principal investigator on funding research totaling $5 million in the areas of improving community mental health systems, integrated healthcare models, child and adult mental health care systems, violence prevention and gang prevention, innovative strategies for providing trauma-informed care in community-based settings, and community engagement strategies to reduce disparities in the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable and underserved populations. Alta's outstanding intelligence, wisdom, grit, leadership, and problem-solving skills led her to make quick work of every opportunity as she has been given, spanning decades. And what a great force Dr. Stewart has been in the trenches of mental health systems across this country. I am so delighted to really learn from Dr. Stewart and really engage in conversations around restorative justice and organizations in mental health to break down senseless barriers that many of us face. She's an outstanding leader. She's a mentor. I'm really nervous because she is such a great mentor and sponsor to many underrepresented, minoritized and racialized psychiatrists in this country, and has championed numerous psychiatric issues of today. Again, Dr. Stewart, thank you for giving us this opportunity to get wisdom from you, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Gordon, and back at you. You are a mentor to me in so many ways. While there is an age difference, there is no difference in our ability to learn from each other. Thank you all for being here. I want to offer a special thanks to my good friend and colleague, Ann Hackman, who initiated this process of getting me here today. I want to thank the Social Justice Committee for their foresight in understanding the importance of today's topic. I want to give a hello in absentia to my good old friend, John Talbot, who sent an email saying that he wouldn't be able to be there, but he would hear about us in our chat today. This is quite, I'm looking at the screen and there are 6 screens on my computer. I don't know how many people, well, I guess over 120 something people that represents. So it's almost as if I were there with you in person. And I suppose if I were there with you in person, I wouldn't have got confused. I wouldn't have gotten confused about the time. I'm in the central time zone. And so I automatically read time in central, and I didn't even pay attention to the 12 to 1 and realize Maryland's in the Eastern time zone. So I was here with my team doing some tech stuff when Kim called and said, you know, are you having any troubles connecting? And I thought, oh my God, it's not Central time. So I do apologize for the delay, and I'll do my best to make up a little time as we move forward with today's. And I'm assuming I have, yes, it seems that I have the ability to share, and I am going to put this in presentation mode and take it away. You know, I have to tell you, 3 times really is the charm. This will be my 3rd opportunity to be invited to be the annual Dana African American lecturer. And the first was earlier in my career, and it was such a great honor. And it was pre-COVID, so I was able to visit and tour various sites and meet people and be in person. The second was also in person. It was later in my career. I was a little more established, more well-established, and realized the great honor that it was, but also the great responsibility that it brought. And now, as I'm moving into the what I call my final chapter in my academic career anyway, here I am again with all of you. And I don't know if any of you have been there for all 3 of these. And if so, I promise this will be new stuff, and I hope helpful stuff for the issue that we are going to discuss today. My title, it took a while for me to come up with the title that resonated with my spirit on this. And I've been doing a lot of work in the area of accountability, measurement, metrics, and stuff. So I thought, instead of just the leadership role, that I would drill down a little into the accountability area when it comes to addressing barriers to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion in academic psychiatry. I really enjoyed hearing the biography as my bio, as Kim read it. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a series of things that I had done. It really did string together what I consider the purpose of my life, which has become specializing in the wholly impossible. That was the title of a chapter that I wrote in the book, Women in Psychiatry. And it chronicled just what Kim read to you. So for me, my time in academic psychiatry has been short, but my belief that is really the place where we can make the biggest impact if we're really going to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if we're going to fundamentally use that to change the system, to change the paradigm, to create the right structure that moves us away from systemic and structural racism into an equitable system of care and training, and all the other things that we long for at this point in the field of psychiatry. And so, because this is a CME event, I must advise you I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. And as you heard, I am president of AACP, but the things that I'm going to talk about today do not reflect any of the views or policies of that organization or any of the others of which I have been honored over which I've been honored to preside. This I adapted from my friend and colleague Ruth Shem after a series of lectures that I heard her give on health equity and structural racism and a host of other issues that she is expert in. And I've come to use this as my second disclaimer slide because the conflict of interest financial disclosure is a requirement for CME and other things. This, I think, is a requirement or should become a requirement for all of the work that we do when it comes to anything related to structural racism, anti-racist psychiatry, health equity, health disparities, all of those things because of the uncomfortableness that many people feel and the challenges they face in addressing and dealing with these things. I think we really ought to encourage this be the kind of disclaimer, and it doesn't have to be this one, but something that says, I understand as we go through this and I speak more in depth about certain things, it's going to make some people uncomfortable. These are very complex feelings, and for folks who have not had a chance to allow them to flow to the surface, to process them, to deal with their own internal perception of self and other as a result of these feelings, it's going to get a little dicey for some people. And I say that up front so that people are aware that I recognize and acknowledge it, but it is not going to stop me from saying things that will leave some people feeling that they're being accused of something or that there is an agenda at work here to do something nefarious or unconscionable or just plain wrong. So this is my disclaimer about all of that. And I say this up front so that there is no mistaking. My intent is to create within the framework of what I can control, both with my words and how I present them to you, what we call in some of our community engagement efforts, particularly with kids and families who are suffering under the issues around mental health and well-being, that we create this gracious space. And I selected this picture primarily because of the work that I do is with kids and families. And I'm a big fan of the artist. And I won't put anyone on the spot. And if you want to drop in the chat, if you think you know who the artist for this is, do that. But it represents for me the kind of calm, positive, impactful image that I would like for people to carry with them as we go through the content today. And finally, one of my families that I worked with several years ago on some family engagement work taught me about crap. And when I said it the first time in a professional setting, people thought I was coming very close to cursing. But crap really is the communities and how communities respond about potential potholes, particularly in the field of family engagement, particularly when we as professionals begin to talk about how to include families into the work that we do, not just as family members, but as equal partners in our teams, equal folks who are helping us to address some of the clinical issues and burdens related to social determinants of health, that there is equal standing. And for the folks on the family side, they coined this phrase to talk about that. I have, again, adapted it to talk about how when we are talking about race, racism, structural issues, diversity, and all of those things that we'll be talking about today, whenever you change the focus from your internal achievement, which is most often described as a white supremacist-centered kind of thinking, to an anti-racist focus, the things that create outcomes that are meaningful to marginalized populations, whether we're talking about our professional folks or folks in the community, to address these issues of social justice, equity, disparities, you will be challenged. And people, and I'm sure the folks who are on the Social Justice Committee, this resonates with you, because just mentioning certain buzzwords brings a flow of why are you always talking about that? What else do we have to do? We've had, excuse me, we've had training sessions, we've had this, and isn't that enough? Well, the answer, to be honest, is no, it's not enough. And for many, it will never be enough. But for our purposes today, just remember, there will be crap. For taking the message of today anywhere else, you will get the crap. As a good friend of mine growing up used to say, sometimes you're the pigeon and sometimes you're the statue. Okay, I thought it might be good to repeat here the learning objectives so that everyone's clear on why I'm talking about certain things. We're talking systems that need redesigning. We're talking about work that institutions and systems put effort into to maintain the structures that are racially biased. And then we're talking about how do we create and use some accountability measures that move the needle on getting academic psychiatry. I would love to address academic medicine, but that's a bigger house than I care to tear down. I'm gonna be okay just focusing on academic psychiatry, which is, as my pastor says, is in my lane. I'm going to stay focused on academic psychiatry. Plus, it's the thing that I am most comfortable and familiar talking about. Okay, I just mentioned my pastor, and I am a Southern girl, so faith and not necessarily evangelical religious, but faith and spirituality are a large part of who I am and my personality. And so I always invoke the spirit of those angels that I rely on. And this is the best representation of African angels that I have ever seen. And I try to include it in every presentation I do on this. But understand, everybody is getting into DEI. It is not solely the purview anymore of us in healthcare to try to figure out what do we need to do. These are just 4 or 5 examples of things that I just pulled off of Google Images to reflect the kinds of groups and corporations and organizations that have decided that DEI is where they want to plant their flag. That's where, for many of these companies, that's where their bottom line is most enhanced. And if we have taken anything away from the corporate environment when it comes to healthcare, we've seen how challenging managed care in its early iteration was for not improving healthcare quality. We are all victims at this point of the fact that we are all caught in this vise, if you will, of health corporate thinking that makes us do things that really are not in the best interest of quality or access or other things, but they're the way the healthcare system has decided to structure itself. And so I thought showing that we are not alone in trying to figure out how DEI can help our bottom line, which really ought to be, no matter where you work, better care for people who need it, access to good care, and a quality of care that is rivaled by none. And when it comes to particular populations, these are critical, quintessentially critical issues that we have to deal with. And DEI is one path that we take to get there, because structuring our systems in a way that creates an environment that allows minoritized and racialized groups to flourish and thrive in our institutions is one way to begin working on improving the kind of healthcare that the patients we all work with are provided. It bears noting that there are various leadership styles. In my experience, and I've been at this, as you heard, for several decades, mostly in large public mental health systems where the components of leadership always included, in addition to whatever your skill set and tools were to be a good leader, there were two other things that were always necessary. One was an understanding of the political environment, because public systems are created by political operatives, elected officials, some people call them, but political operatives who, by their own admission, do things for reasons other than what we as trained physicians, clinicians would like to see as the end game. And so that's the one thing, that these are people for whom healthcare and what it can be and what it should do are not always their end game. The second thing is that, and I've learned lessons that I'll just share with you over the years. In politics, and therefore in the healthcare that derives from politics, there are no permanent enemies and no permanent friends, only common interest. And those interests change depending on when the political climate changes. And so if you factor in, you got to have a certain skill set to be a good leader, or to demonstrate a leadership style that is positive, impactful, and moving the needle in the right direction, then you also have to understand those other two things. You're working in the public system anyway, you are working with people who are not your friend in that respect. And you're working against a system that is constantly in flux. It's changing all the time to meet the political need. So I've taken out of the leadership style book, I've taken three that I think would be very descriptive for today's purposes around leadership accountability for access and for improving and addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in academic psychiatry. The first is the transformational leader, and I'll give you an example of that. The second is transactional. We have recently seen an example of what that leadership style looks like. And the third is passive avoidant, and I would dare say that there are people on the screen who have been the beneficiaries of passive avoidant leaders in their lifetime. Experience in their lifetime. My favorite example of someone who is a transformational leader is Nelson Mandela. I think he is the epitome, the primary best example of someone who accepts the mantle of leadership at a time when there is so much chaos, so much conflict, so much everything that is working against moving forward. He embraces it, and he uses it to transform not a system, but a nation. And I think we learn things from people like Nelson Mandela that are transferable to the work that we do in medicine and in psychiatry and academia. Transformational leaders have an idealized sense of influence. They always demonstrate to you that it's not about them, it is about you all. It's not self-interest, but for the group. They are moral, ethical creatures to a fault, despite the fact that morality and ethical behavior often does a disservice to them and their future, and in some cases their lives. They maintain that stance. They are inspirational. They are the pursuers of the possible and not the pursuers of the inevitable destruction of everything. They are hopeful and optimistic. Brian Stevenson is another one of those people who remains optimistic in the face of the work that he does for people who are unjustly charged and tried and incarcerated. They are constantly examining and re-examining the critical areas to measure against their own metric whether what they are doing and proposing is appropriate for that moment. And they are always reaching back to bring someone else along. The succession planning of the millennium, I think, is that mentor who in turn looks at a Kim Gordon and says, I believe in your leadership ability. I believe you have the capability. I am here to help you develop that and to hold out my hand when you're stumbling to bring you along. And that's not sponsoring, that is still that individualized consideration of others that allows them to develop that level of confidence in themselves. Sorry to put you on the spot, Kim. I also would have, and I guess I did since they're here, these are also examples of transformational leaders. I have often described myself as a transformational leader because for me, it was never about retiring from a job. It was about accomplishing in that way that that the leader can get out of their own way, get things done, and then recognize that my job is not to stay here to do it. My job is to create opportunities for other people to pick up the mantle and do it. And I'm just very fond of that wanted poster. I once tried to put myself here in the middle because, as you can see, well-behaved women seldom make history. And I would count it amongst my greatest honors to be with this group of women making transformation in the systems that they worked in. I mentioned earlier that transactional leadership, we've seen evidence of it this week. I love this cartoon. I actually love the cartoonist. I think he's right on. But I think this cartoon captures some of that transactional leadership. We witnessed in the public purview the navigating of the transaction to become the leader in a way that I've never seen in any of the political areas that I've been involved in. So I thought this would be an example of a transactional leader because it's very clear. If you are transactional in your leadership, you make it clear. You get rewarded for what I see you are doing that I want done, and I will keep a list. You know, this is the opposite of Santa. I'm keeping a list of everything, and you will pay. And you know, I have no idea what the future for the speaker in his leadership role will be, but he is evidence to me that transactional leadership remains. The passive avoidant, I know I've had my share of them. And you don't have to shake your head or raise your hand, but I know there are people who've been exposed to passive avoidant leadership. And again, a cartoon was the best way to create the image in your mind of what this person in a leadership role does. I've created a searchable database of 100,000 excuses for anything that could possibly go wrong around here. And these are people who wait for things to go wrong before taking action. These are not proactive people. These are not people who do a lot of follow-up on any strategic plan that is done. If something is going well, they leave it alone and they don't kind of forecast how things could get derailed if this happens or when this happens, that things will get derailed. And they, at all costs, avoid making decisions until it is absolutely necessary, which generally translates into someone told me I better do something and make this go away. That's generally how decisions are made by the passive avoidant. And depending on the level of passivity and avoidance that they are willing to show you, if you are the recipient or working for someone who is a passive avoidant leader, you recognize when the other shoe is about to drop, because the conversation generally starts with, it wasn't my idea. I'm sorry to have to tell you, or I guess you've noticed, or something that begins the process of, I didn't do it. And I'm the youngest in the family, so I recognize the I didn't do it behavior and sentence structure long before people finish the sentence. And the youngest child, who is a girl in a Southern family, gets away with a lot. So I recognize this behavior and have, I think, found it to be actually kind of entertaining in my world. But I'm at a different point in my career than many of you, so I get to play around with those things. So those are leadership styles. When it comes to the academic setting, particularly academic psychiatry, and I included, or I separated on learning, because I think often in academia, we think of the academic component as training, like med student, resident, fellow, early career, maybe. But we forget there is a lifelong learning process that we should all be involved in. And there is no exception or exclusion from that lifelong learning when it comes to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. This is not a one and done kind of issue. whether it's the work setting and the environment that you work in and your leadership hierarchy, there are aspects of this material that have to permeate at all of those levels. And again, is not a one and done, but must be repeated. People must demonstrate competence in this area. It must be attached to some consequence if it's going to be meaningful and effective. The issue of well-being is one that we talk about a lot, mostly because we're talking more about burnout and how well-being is one of the ways that we deal with burnout. But I mean well-being in the broader sense, whether it's for the individual and their sense of self and confidence and other things, or whether it actually is, how is the group functioning? What is the group's well-being that we are trying to support as we implement our DEI activities? And that's an issue that academic psychiatry leadership really has not paid a lot of attention to in the pure sense. We have programs, we offer webinars, we give some, differing time off kinds of things. But in terms of thinking through what would be an environment where well-being is not just possible, but it is the expected outcome for everyone in our work setting, our environment, and under our leadership. What does that look like? Professionalism has taken on a whole different I don't even know what to call it, attitude, position, experience. When I was coming along, and for many of you on the screen who kind of look like me by the head, when we were coming along, professionalism was about how you dressed, how you interacted with your superiors and your patients, the language you use, your demeanor. Professionalism now has devolved into how I wear my hair, which is an expression of my culture, and what that says about me and what it means you can say to me. I recently counseled a young woman who was spoken to in front of the class by a faculty member with the question, "What have you done to your hair? What is that?" In front of the group, as if it were his business, first of all, as if it were anything that ought to be discussed in the classroom, first of all, second of all, and as if it didn't matter. The way that he did it was demeaning, disrespectful, and inappropriate in an environment where we profess that we are welcoming and DEI focused. And she was, of course, beside herself because she didn't, when you're low man on the totem pole, there are things you don't think you can say or do. And luckily, she was comfortable enough to seek counsel about how to handle it and what to do. But for many of our young people who are still experiencing, I don't want that doctor to see me because they're this, and this, or I don't want you. People who are reporting in emergency settings that patients refuse to be evaluated, and that the staff that is surrounding that individual does nothing to intervene. Like, say, all of our doctors are well equipped to handle the issue that you have come in with. If you choose to go elsewhere for your services, that is acceptable, but we don't allow anyone to talk to our doctors like that. Those are now creeping into the discussion of professionalism. And again, we are not dealing with them adequately. If I am still hearing from young Black women the same stories that I had experiences with when I was a young Black intern, then we are not doing a good job of dealing with these things in our academic environments. The whole notion of health equity and how we train and how we teach people to practice in an equitable setting with an equitable approach to healthcare has raised a red flag for many of us, because the consistency of content is one challenge. The consistency of the teaching method is a second, and for me, a more troubling component, because if I'm not comfortable that you understand health equity based on how you relate to me and the patients that I know you are part of the clinical care team for, then I don't know that I'm comfortable with you training the next generation of people to learn how to do that well. And then the obvious anti-racism in psychiatry issue that we have been dealing with, and how we are training and engaging in practice using an anti-racist approach in psychiatry to providing that care is one that we still have some work to do things on. So a leader creates change. A leader does not passively sit by and say, well, as soon as we get the outcome of the strategic plan and the direction on what aspects of that are our responsibility, we'll get about the business of doing something. The leader creates the change. You create the understanding for why the change is needed, which means you have to have an understanding of why change is needed. You have to embrace that, and you have to make it clear to the people that work for you. Since you are the leader, you have to make it clear to them that you expect them to embrace, embody, and lead by example to their subordinates, and that you will not tolerate not doing that. The leader designs the agenda for what to expect and how to address those challenges and barriers to change. That means that if I'm the leader, I have to have at least an idea. In my work, for example, as you heard, I work in something that we created about 7 years ago when I joined the university. I came to create the Center for Youth Advocacy and Wellbeing to address a local issue around our young, mostly Black male kids who were being directed into juvenile justice and away from mental health treatment. And in 7 years, we've had the single agenda of reducing the rate of engagement in the juvenile justice system, changing the way we perceive these young people by changing language. We don't call kids juvenile here. We call them children, adolescents, young people, youth, young adults. And we are promoting that such that groups at the state are now changing committee names and changing language and legislation to reflect that. So our agenda was change the image that we have of these kids, because they are not just bad kids, change the way we approach them using programs and supports and including their families and community, and change how the external world, law enforcement, prosecution, the court, everybody sees them, the schools, how they see them based on the work that we do with them. And that agenda has not changed. Today, we are the go-to organization in town. As you heard, we've got over $5 million in grants from a variety of sources to do this agenda, and we keep growing. We're just now getting 2 new grants that'll probably total a couple of $1 million, because now we have the experience and the reputation that it takes to make that kind of system change. We're still working on some of the racism. This is Memphis, the city where Dr. King was assassinated. So we've got some ongoing racial issues to deal with. But in terms of the agenda for change, the leadership from me and my team has been very clear from the beginning, and it is not changing at this point. Finally, the leader has to have the will to understand that whether it is your personal will or your political will and power and influence that you will, you have to sometimes make those tough choices that create the environment for change. So understanding the challenge is one of those things. The usual suspects, the fragility of white organizations that we've all come to understand. And I put fragility in quotes because I'm not sure that it's fragile, mostly white predominant organizations, or it is resistance to change because privilege is something that we covet. And I'm not opposed to privilege. Let me go on the record, since this is being recorded. I am not opposed to privilege. I am opposed to privilege not being used in the service of all. And so these unwelcoming environments, leaders have to understand that. Leaders have to make sense of that and where that unwelcomeness, if you will, is, and change those things. And then we all now know that every school worth its salt has an Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, or Diversity, Inclusion, Equity, or EDI, some variation on a theme of acronyms that mean those 3 things. They are generally underfunded, devalued by the rest of the institution. They're peripheral and not mainstream in terms of we have to have one because the AAMC or LCME or somebody said we have to have a diversity office and someone who's responsible, but it's only part of the institution mission institutional mission as it relates to our community work. It's not fundamentally incorporated into our real work of training and other things. The leader has to have an agenda. This is a quote from Mark Neve, who was the former consultant, a former, I think he was VP for diversity for the AAMC. And he said this in a talk once that I heard, and I've always liked it for that last little phrase, that rather than continuing to see it as just another problem to be fixed, that we consider diversity and inclusion as the solution to our problems. If we are in fact a multiracial society, and if that racial mix is starting to lean towards more people of color than not, and if our services are not designed to address their sometimes unique cultural, racial, ethnic needs, then we are not addressing the fundamental issue about improving quality, because we can't seem to get our arms around how to create a more diverse, inclusive, and welcoming workforce to do that work. And that's a challenge, folks, that we have got to keep working on, because we're actually just getting started on this. I mean, what's happened over the last couple of years in terms of recognizing racism in America by a vast majority of Americans came about as a result of some very tragic events, a pandemic, a global pandemic, which forced us all to be locked down, a series of racially motivated lethal events in our communities across the nation, and a recognition or lack of recognition that these are problems that we have to work on and face, and that healthcare is not exempt from these problems. All of this happened in the last few years. So we're really just starting the work we needed to do back in 1910 when Flexner wrote his report that closed most of the Black medical schools and began this process of creating a system where health disparities reign, because there were not opportunities for Black people to get trained, and therefore to be part of a growing workforce from a healthcare standpoint, and therefore to eliminate some of the challenges that a racially segregated healthcare system, which was also condoned by the federal government through the Hill-Burton Act, but that system was allowed to flourish and keep reducing the possibility that anyone who was not white would get good medical care, because there simply weren't enough resources out there to deal with them. And there is a history of how we've tried to approach these things. I always start with 1970. We could go back further, but 1970 was when the American Journal of Psychiatry had its special section on racism. And there were 6 or 7 articles written by a variety of people talking specifically about the kinds of things that we are still talking about today. This was 1970. Dimensions of Institutional Racism in Psychiatry is a title we could have today in one of those, in one of the journals. And this was written, by the section was edited by Mel Sapshin, who went on to become medical director for the APA. And he laid out a blueprint, a really nice blueprint, even in today's contemporary framework, a really nice blueprint of where psychiatry could start, whether it was the clinical setting, the training setting, or the research arena. And then in that same section, there was this article written by Billy Jones et al., Problems of Black Psychiatric Residents in White Training Institutes. I promise you, I have shared this with many, many residents and fellows, and they are experiencing the same things that these guys, because there were no women included, unfortunately, in their article, but the same things these guys were facing in 1970 that they wrote about are similar to the experiences that many of our trainees are still having. It's 1970. So I started in 1970. And I come up to 2020, 22. And this is the SMART tool. And this is not a promotion for the American Association for Community Psychiatry, although it was developed by 3 of our spectacularly excellent members. The SMART tool is something that allows any organization to assess its own capability to practice in an anti-racist framework. and offer suggestions for how to improve if you are not already in that mindset. I don't know that any academic settings have used it yet, but I think from an accountability standpoint, for anyone who's looking for a starting point, looking at some of those questions, which are mostly designed for community-based organizations, but who knows, if an academic institution wanted it customized to suit their need to assess their own services, I'm sure that the creators of the tool would love to talk with someone about doing that. And that was a little bit of a promo. But let's move on to some accountability. I'm going to show you 3 word clouds. This has kind of the educational piece because it's medical school. And it's a little blurry, but take my word, I could not find culture, racism, race, ethnicity, or anything, disparities, anything that suggested that whoever created this asked any questions about diversity, culture, or structural racism. This one on healthcare, I was sure that if I just did a Google search of healthcare word cloud, that I would find one that prominently displayed disparities. And I found one with disparity, but not prominently displayed. It was kind of over here on the side in the small print. And then equity, mental health, all of these are, we all know how word clouds are created. These are the kinds of things, and I'm sorry, I didn't think about trying to do one and have you guys, but it might have been a bit off-putting because we're talking about diversity, racism, and stuff. So someone would have included it. But in the event that we ever do this, take a look at, if you're doing this, take a look at how often those issues are not included as a central component of what we do. And if it's not a central component in the minds of the professionals when we do these things, how on earth are we sure it is ever being expressed as a mechanism to provide good quality care? And that's something I think we all have a responsibility for, that it has to become part of the lexicon of our world, that we talk about these things on a regular basis. If we're talking about psychopharmacology, we need to talk about the differences in psychopharmacological response to certain medications based on certain biological constructs within an individual who reflects a certain cohort of the population. And this is different from making race a medical or making medicine a race-based issue. It is reflecting in the concept of how we learn, how we train, how we treat, that we take into account any uniqueness about an individual that may impact our ability to provide them the best possible care. There are some key principles that I usually leave people with to talk about how you create a successful path to leadership for people from marginalized groups. And I always highlight some of the more recent work by myself and a group of young women that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in March of 2021. And this was an editorial that I did as a companion piece to an article that I'm going to show you in a second. But this is what I would leave the leaders on the call with. Leaders in key positions must recognize some of the unintentional but well-institutionalized barriers in their own systems and implement strategies that create more balanced, equitable, and welcoming environments for these individuals. That is so important for the leader to embrace, incorporate into their being, to engage in conversation with their subordinates on, that we may not intend it, but there are things that when we look closely and we listen well, we will see are institutionalized barriers to how people who are underrepresented in medicine or from those groups, how they perceive our systems, how they operate within our systems, and their challenges of being in our systems, and that we have the responsibility for right sizing that, for making that more balanced, equitable, and welcoming for them. This is an excerpt from a Psych News Alert written around the time that the articles were published. And Ayanna Jordan, who's on the faculty now in New York at NYU, is I think one of the best architects of framing some of the work that we do. There are several others, but I served on the board, the APA Board of Trustees with Ayanna. And one of the phrases that I have drawn from that she famously made, for me anyway, a common saying, was that we have to move away from what I called earlier, the white supremacy centering perspective of decision-making into a more culturally specific, culturally focused concept for decision-making. Changing and reflecting that change based on just that little turn, and that everyone has to do it. The people of color as well as their white colleagues all have to remove themselves from that white supremacist framework. And the article that was written in the AJP, said lots of things. I've just taken 3 or 4 bullets out just to use as examples of just things that leaders need to be aware of, that they are responsible for doing. Clarity in role and responsibility for the DEI position is something that is fundamental to its effectiveness. Clarity in role and responsibility of everybody on your team, faculty, trainees, staff, employees, everybody has a responsibility. Everybody will be held accountable, and that's the responsibility of the leader. Making the level of the standing for this individual high enough to signify the importance, and their inclusion in all of the leadership meetings signifies to others that there is a level playing field when it comes to the work that they do. They are not under the medical student education or graduate medical education or clinical care team. They are equal in standing in the eyes of the institution, and that not allowing them to function at that level is unacceptable, and that there is, the appropriate kind of salary support and staff to carry out whatever they're asked to do. I just, at the last minute, I thought, well, I'll just, because you're going to get these slides, so I'll just add some other things that for people who really are struggling with, I don't know where to start. This is just a little snippet of things that I think are easy reads, painful for some people, but easy reads and easy to follow. And I'm never sure if people understand this slide. Minority tax is a phrase that was coined to describe how, if you are a marginalized, racialized, minoritized, whichever language this group most often use, if you are part of that group, there is always a component in the academic arena. There is always a component, and I can testify to this from my own experience of the last 7 years, where you are asked, because you are from that group, to do something to increase the diversity in something, whether it's a search committee, the diversity group, presenting to the alumni association, whatever it is, you are asked primarily because you represent that group, which is tokenizing. And that means that these are activities that you don't get credit for when it's time to put together your promotion package. If you're serving on a committee, you ought to be able to count that. But if you're serving on that committee that would otherwise be all white, and your role on that committee is not the leader of the committee, and your role as a member is not, well described by the convener of the search committee or the leader of the search committee, to reflect that this is institutional level important work. Having that on your CV when it comes time for promotion is like, oh, well, you didn't really have a role, you were just there. And I've had people put together their promotion packages and asked me to review them and asked, well, didn't you serve on that? Yeah, but I was just there because my chair thought we ought to have a minority. You know, part of this is reflecting for people the importance of this role, but if it's uncompensated, like extra duty at the free clinic because it's a clinic that serves Black people and there's really nobody else to do it. So could you take over there for a while? That's really not the kind of credibility that people use to build their confidence and to feel comfortable talking about, because in their mind, they're only there because. And while that may not be true, it is a part of something that we call the minority tax. Conversely, there is a majority tax. And this is less often talked about, but it's where our white colleagues really have to take upon themselves learning about this whole race-based medicine and structural racism and all of those things that we talk about all the time that people say, well, I don't know anything about it. Can you tell me? People have to take that upon themselves to learn and to really become knowledgeable in, and to use that as they leverage their white privilege when they're with colleagues who are non-minority, to demonstrate this knowledge and to challenge the barriers of structural racism. The minority taxpayer confronts racism with much more at stake than anybody who's paying the majority tax will. Just my opinion. I also include pictures of people that I think, for me anyway, reflect what I'm talking about. People who've been my mentors, who've been there for me to help me think through things, people who have challenged me to get outside of where I think I should be and aim for something else, and people who have supported me and sponsored me and covered me when others have come out after me. And I can think of no better person for that than Dr. Bell. And this young woman here is me back when people were telling me what I couldn't do. And Dr. Bell said, risk factors are not predictive factors due to protective factors. Usually I use this when I'm talking about the kids that I work with who are on the path into the justice system for lack of someone creating a different path for them. Well, this young woman was told that she would never be a doctor, she shouldn't apply to any medical schools that were not HBCUs, and that even if she made it, she wouldn't really get to work in some of the positions that I have been honored to work in. And so it was a risk for a little Black girl from Memphis where Dr. King was assassinated, where racism in my lifetime was a very real thing, you know, colored only signs and back of the bus and balcony of the movie theater were my life experiences early on. So those risk factors did not predict where I would end up because of these protective factors. The people in my life who made sure that I understood that instead of a white supremacist framing for my decision-making, that I could claim, I could stand at the border, like Toni Morrison writes, I could stand at the border at the edge and claim it as my central, that I could claim it that way and let the rest of the world come over to where I was. And for me, that has been an effective way to figure out what I can do for other people. And for leaders, this is what I do. I ask them to increase their awareness and knowledge that racism exists, even in academia, and that structural racism is what drives health inequity. I ask them to take an honest individual and institutional inventory of their system. And if you use the SMART tool, all the better, but there are other ways to do that kind of an inventory once you invest yourself in doing it, and that going forward, in the training and professional development level at your institution, always ask racial equity here, not here. That's what we all can do. The other things, and I won't read all of these, but the other things that I think are important is that leaders make space for these conversations, that you are willing to have them and that you create spaces for them to happen, that you make sure to understand that we have to change a narrative that is supporting a structurally racist system, that is our work. This is only one part of dismantling structural racism, particularly in healthcare. that it should be applied across the board: education, training, workforce development, research. Everything that we do in setting up healthcare systems ought to have this as part of the foundation. We have to collect the data, we have to analyze that data, and we have to make our decisions and make changes based on those data, metrics, and outcomes. This is the work across all levels at the academic level. And remaining proximate, having hope, and doing these uncomfortable things is a part of what we all have to do. This is kind of my favorite part of ending this talk, because I get to share with you some of the things. This is the group that wrote the book, Women in Psychiatry, Personal Perspectives, where my chapter on specializing in the wholly impossible was published. This was 2012. In 2018, when I became the Senior Associate Dean for Community Health Engagement, I went to what I call the AAMC Dean's College. There were 7 psychiatrists. One is not in this picture because he had to leave early. There were 7 psychiatrists at varying levels, including one dean of a newly established medical school, at all levels, where psychiatrists were now in non-psychiatric leadership roles. We weren't just in our departments of psychiatry. We were across the board in these institutions, including one person who was DEI. And this is the reference for the article. This is a group, 5 of the 9 authors of this article. This was 2019. In my years, as I was ending my year as president, I met with them. And I was honored that year to receive this T-shirt identifying Solomon Carter Fuller, who was the first Black psychiatrist in the nation. Jean Spurlock, who we all know was the deputy medical director for the APA for years and headed up the office of what was then the Office of Minority National Affairs. Chester Pierce, who coined the phrase microaggressions, in addition to a host of other things that he is responsible for starting, and myself being honored on this T-shirt. So this group came and met and did a discussion. This was their little discussion time because they didn't have a meeting room, so they met in my room. And this was their discussion time to talk about diversity, leadership, and academic medicine. And the article that was written was published as a result of this group's work, was published 2 years later in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Another slide, just to remind you as you review this material, there are specific things we can do along the way, from before medical school, into medical school, residency fellowship, early career, and lifelong learning. Things that we all have a responsibility for doing. And then if you're still not sure, consider this slide. And I don't want to give anybody nightmares, but consider this slide. This is the slide for me that reflects, if you're serious about doing DEI work, if you're serious about eliminating health disparities, if you really want to achieve a system where equitable healthcare is the law, of your institution, is the rule of order in your institution, then you have to be the cat in this picture, because this is the lineup of people who do not want to see any of those things happen. And these German shepherds, as you can tell, if you are a dog person, are poised, waiting for the attack sign. The cat, on the other hand, has her tail up, curled, very relaxed, and not even, she has dismissed them out of hand and is walking by them as if she has no care in the world, because she's committed to DEI. So thank you for your time and attention. And I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. I really appreciate you coming here for the 3rd time and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you to Dr. Hackman and the Social Justice Education Subcommittee for really shepherding this process. And thank you to Dr. Gordon for that wonderful introduction. We would like to take a moment to get questions from the audience. And Dr. Stewart, we have 2 responses to your question, your photo with the artist. So
Okay.
One person's asking, is it Romare Bearden? The other person said, is it Jacob Lawrence?
I love it. 2 of my favorite artists. And that particular one is Romare Bearden. I'm sorry, is Jacob Lawrence. So I'm glad to know that there's some art history lovers in the crowd.
Okay, great. So Catherine, you are correct. You get a prize. We'll figure out a prize later. Okay, Dr. McClam has her hand up, so we'll let her ask her question.
Hi. Oh, thank you, Dr. Stewart. That was an incredible talk. So many questions I have, but the one I wanted to ask, you kind of touched on it briefly. In terms of diversity and inclusion, you kind of mentioned it briefly when you were talking about how patients can be sort of disrespectful to physicians, and then there's discussion about professionalism in that area. What, if anything, can be done to sort of help dispel some of the ongoing stereotypes, particularly within the African American community, regarding the age and race and gender of the provider? Because I am in geriatric psychiatry, and so of course I get the you don't look like, yeah, you look like, yeah, you look like you're my grandkid.
Mhm.
So just what are your thoughts about that? I know that's a whole separate grand rounds.
Well, actually, you might have noticed in the presentation, I tend to direct my frustration and stuff into humor
Mhm.
and to examples of things that I think people can connect with. And I think if someone of one of my elders, and I was working with them, said, "You look, baby, you look too young
Yeah.
to be a doctor. You could be my grandchild." And you know what? I hope that when your grandchild becomes a doctor, if that's what they want to do, I hope somebody like you encourages them to keep working hard in that area. You know, a grandparent is proud of a grandchild. And I will tell you, even a grandparent of a child in the juvenile court system finds something to be proud of them for.
Okay.
So when you reflect back for them, as psychiatry is known to do, that whole
Right.
reflecting thing back, as opposed to taking umbrage and tightening up, when you say, "Thank you so much. I'm sure my grandmother, if she, you know, depending on your circumstance, if she was still alive, I'm sure my
Mhm.
grandmother would be proud of me too." Just don't buy into that. I'm not young, I'm not old enough. Let them kind of roast you as
Mhm.
their the reflection of their lineage. And that if their grandchild is interested, you ought to tell them to come down and do a walk around with me sometime to see
Mhm.
what it's like. Because a lot of Black kids don't get to do that because they don't know doctors. So,
Right.
you know, anything I can do to help your grandchild. And by the time you do that, either they're full of pride that they have acknowledged something, or they're embarrassed that they said it.
Okay.
Either way, you don't buy into the "you're not something enough." Because that's a rabbit hole. If you go down that rabbit hole, it's gonna turn bad quick. Because you can't disrespect your elder,
Right.
you can't argue with them.
Right.
All you can really do is reflect and deflect.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you.
Useful skills, by the way, for a psychiatrist, because that's how we get trained.
Oh,
Yes, and as a geriatric psychiatrist, I'm consistently using my my age as humor when I question. So thank you.
That's a great question, though. Thank you.
I have a question, Dr. Stewart. Since the content of this talk is really about leadership accountability, what do you have to say to leaders who have seen various iterations of DEI work, especially in these most recent years, but who have still really not engaged fully in the work? Like they're sort of paying it lip service. They may have agreed, yes, this is important, but they're not doing the things that you recommended in terms of that knowledge building and also the implementation that you talked about. What are some words of advice or some things that you would reflect to those leaders?
Well, you know, I'm gonna answer this, but I'm gonna tell you a story. I'm a Southerner. When I was growing up, my dad listened to country western, and I remember the Grand Ole Opry and Hee Haw and all that stuff. Some of y'all may not even know what I'm talking about, but westerns became one of my favorite things. And there is a quintessential piece of a western where the good guy says, "You better watch out because I'm coming for you." And what I would say to a leader who gives lip service, who says all the right things but makes no changes, is people like me are inspiring to people who want to see change. And eventually someone is going to step up and say, "You're only doing lip service. You're not making change. This has to stop." and put them on the spot. And it can be quietly, one-on-one. It can be in the middle of a meeting like this, where someone calls them out. It might be a letter of protest from a department saying to the dean, this is unacceptable. We are saying things that we are not doing, and we find this reprehensible. It is against the mission of this university. There are all kinds of possibilities for the good guy to have a showdown with the guy in the black hat.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for a few more questions. If anybody wants to type a question into the chat or
Favorite Western, you know, anything like that?
I have I see Dr. Reeves had a question. I'll let her go first.
Hi, Dr. Stewart. Thanks so much for the presentation. So our department, and I'm sure lots of other departments, are developing initiatives around increasing the diversity of our research pipeline. And one of the fun aspects of that has been to reach out to really young children, really at the elementary school level, and plan some activities around that. I was just appreciate any guidance you have about some strategies or principles when doing outreach to young students about when your goal is around increasing the diversity of that pipeline and really expanding awareness about opportunities, that sort of thing. So I appreciate any advice about the outreach to the very young.
Well, I think that you can be very creative with the very young. I've started to think less of a pipeline and more of a pathway. Pipeline generally indicates to someone that there is a single kind of place that you're going, whereas pathway is a little broader. We do, for example, outreach to kids in STEM schools as early as grade school through our community garden, getting them out talking about plants and flowers and how things grow to kind of stimulate what is this all about? You know, I grew up under during the time when, what was his name? Mr. Wizard or Mr. Science or somebody, I forget the character, but you know, he did the bubble things and the exploding volcano and all of that stuff. And that was intriguing and kind of piqued my curiosity about how things worked. I wasn't one of the kids who took things apart, but there are those kids who like to take things apart and see if they can put them back together. And for those kids, it may not be medicine, it may be Mr. Wizard, thank you. It may be biomedical engineering, that you know, robotics, computer programming and stuff. Not everybody is going to want to do medicine in the sense that we are thinking of, but we need diversity, especially in the research arena. We need diversity in other areas than the scientist in the lab who is the PI on in a big NIH grant. So I'm trying to think, is there something else? As often as you can get before them with fun learning stuff is a good thing, you know, whether it's the hosting or sponsoring a science fair with a series of things that have something to do with health. You know, how sprouting the potato tells them about time and change and other things. One of my earliest science fair projects was a mouse on a treadmill that was supposed to light up the light bulb, you know, generate enough power to light up the light bulb. It never really worked, but it was a fascinating idea for me anyway, that something like that could be done. And maybe it wasn't the mouse on the treadmill, and it wrecked the holiday that I had this mouse in the house, a little white mouse in the house over the holiday. That was not fun. Second only to the dissected cat that I took home in medical school. But I was intense. What can I tell you? I was intense. But do stuff, come up with fun ideas with the teacher on things that are sciencey kind of things that get their attention. No dissected cats, no white mice, but just about anything else. Plants, like I said, the garden thing talks about growth and change and what happens when you don't pay attention to the health of the potato or the garden or whatever, and it dies. And you can relate that to all kinds of things. Astronomy, gets them into their creative mindset, thinking about stars and travel and astronauts and specialists and the mission and that sort of thing. Just, nothing, particularly, exciting, but just stuff that gets their imagination going.
Thank you very much.
Uh-huh. I see another hand, Stephanie Hare.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have kind of a practical question too. So on our little DEI committee at our small research center out at a state hospital, we work mostly with psychosis patients, but our little team we put together a survey on satisfaction for the patients and cultural competence. And so now we kind of have those results and we're looking at them. So I just wanted to get your advice. We have kind of like areas of improvement, which are still like a 4 out of 5. And just like, I have your slide in mind and designing the agenda for what to expect and how to actually address the changes. So some of them I see as easy as, yes, we don't have very racially diverse, depictions of patients in the waiting room. And that was kind of the top area of improvement. But it was also requested, if they want help from clergy or spiritual leaders, can the counselors and physicians, help them with that? And I see that as a little trickier. But I think maybe at a minimum, we need to have follow-up discussions with the clinical team. But I just kind of wanted to give you that background and ask for any advice kind of once we have some results and we're looking to improve things for our patients, what you think.
Well, I think it's wonderful that you are engaged in that kind of assessment and inventory of what you do and don't do with a particular group of patients. I'm a big, I'm a community psychiatrist. It's all I've ever done. It's all I know. I talking with folks outside of the clinical team is just what I do. And so for me, if any patient says to me, I really, I've gotten away from my spiritual roots and I really felt grounded there. It was a good experience for me. I'm going to move heaven and earth to figure out how to incorporate that into the work that we do with that patient. In addition, from the standpoint of working with racialized, minoritized, ethnic, racial, ethno-racial populations, and I use all of those because I'm never sure what the group think is about how to describe. So forgive me if it gets a little long in the explaining. But I don't think you can work with populations without figuring out what cultural strengths, behaviors, help-seeking things matter to them. And for many of these groups, racially, ethnic populations, culture is embodied in part by religion, spirituality, something that speaks to not just a higher power, but a strength that resides and comes from outside of them that brings them comfort and peace. And that's the only way I can describe it. There may be a better way of saying it, but I'm not talking about organized religion as much as I am about whatever they perceive to be what brings me a sense of peace. When my voices are the loudest, this helps me. When I am feeling most anxious, being here helps me. If that place is any kind of house of faith, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, whatever it is, they need access to that as part of their clinical care. And if we don't give that to them, I would consider us not providing the best quality care. And to be honest, compared to what it was like a decade ago, I am finding more and more the faith community generally more responsive to being part of a treatment plan. We have churches, this is the Bible Belt. We have churches here, you can't spit without hitting the church, okay, is the way we describe it. So I can pick up the phone and call a minister, a rabbi, I'm not that close in the Muslim community yet, but I can pick up the phone and say, I've got somebody who lives in this neighborhood. Is there a church in your network that I can encourage them to seek out, a relationship with, for the support, for the socialization, for the sense of welcomingness? And I've got a network of them that will come if we need someone to talk about incorporating faith into the treatment process. I've got a network that will come to do that. I've cultivated that just for the purpose of supporting the people that we work with. And remember, I work mostly with kids. So for most of the work that I do, I'm looking for a church that has something to offer young people and their families, whether it's after school, weekends, a camp, something where they can be comforted and welcomed and not made to feel like you're bad. You've been in juvenile court, you're bad, or you were sent away, you're bad. And that they get that sense of family support that they don't get anywhere else.
Thank you.
Sorry. In the interest of time, we have two questions. One in the chat. Catherine, you have your hand raised. And Kim, I know that there's a session following this. If you want to just put the details of that in the chat for everybody, the link. So the question from the chat, it says, thank you, Dr. Stewart. Can you share any experiences you may have had with dealing with a passive avoidant leadership? Or can you give suggestions on how one can deal with such leadership?
I can share. I'm going to have to be careful about the detail because it would be fairly obvious where I had this experience. But suffice it to say that I had worked in one place, went to another place, was recruited back to the first place, came back to the first place, and ran into a challenge that I had never experienced with a colleague, and noticed that the director who had brought me in was watching it unfold, but not doing anything. So I approached him and said, I really need your guidance on this, and I'd really like some help because I want to resolve this. And the response was, there's nothing I can do. That's about as passive and avoidant as a leader as I've ever had. And I ultimately, in good standing with the person, I had to recognize that this was not going to change in my favor or even be resolved to a point where I could tolerate it. And so I left and went to another position. That's the ultimate, I think, passive avoidant leader that I've had. And to be honest, we remained friends. I just couldn't work anymore. There's a point where you have to protect yourself and your psyche and your sense of well-being. And I had passed that point because there's certain things you as the leader of a certain program cannot manage without the leader over the organization supporting you in.
Very true. Okay, Catherine, your hand was up. She's still on.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I feel like this is like a classic doorknob moment, so I sort of hesitant to speak. But I work in our psych emergency services, and Baltimore is primarily a Black and brown city, and many of our patients have struggles with mental illness, but also with addiction and with the sequelae of poverty and homelessness and all these things. Not everybody, but lots do. And we work really hard, despite society has decided not to make, housing and food and stuff available for people, to try to fix what we can and connect people to the right places. But there are some patients who come in and they're like, you're doing this to me because I'm Black. The cops picked me up because they're unfair to me. And I'm like, well, you were walking around with a knife. And they're like, well, that's because they're unfair. Or you're not giving me my benzos because you're racist. And it's like, no, I'm not giving you your benzos because you had to be Narcaned a bunch of times, and you're mixing stuff, and your tox has 5 or 6 different things in it. And this will kill you. How do you address that, where you acknowledge the bias and the systemic racism and the stuff that is totally true, and say I think that I get that and I'm trying to help you, but like I still can't, I still have to certify you, or I still have to medicate you, or I still can't give you everything that you want. Because sometimes racism is like this like magic word where folks are like, if I call you racist, then I scare you, and then I get what I want because I can act out. And that's a very disruptive and really like painful thing that happens in the unit. And it's hard for the whole team, which is really diverse, to help patients who are clearly hurting.
Well, that's a longer than a minute answer,
Yeah.
but you kind of did answer your own question. The best approach for me when someone sends up that red flag, and I know that there are other circumstances, other extenuating circumstances that are a challenge to me doing what you're asking me to do that are not related to anything racial. Other than the fact that the system structurally may be racial, that our interaction here is not based on that. On this issue, that is not the basis for it. And when you said it's kind of, disruptive and it's not accurate, and I wish that it were as simple as that, because then we'd know how to fix it. But if there are real issues, whether it's reimbursement, whether it's responsiveness to the recommended treatment plan, whatever the real issue is your only ammunition for responding. Anything else gets you into a push and pull tug of war around you being racist and me calling you racist, and your perception that when I do that, you're gonna do something to avoid feeling like you're racist. And
Right.
that's really not the issue. The issue is, what is the best level of care that you can provide this individual? What is needed in this case that may not be what they're asking for, but what is in your professional judgment, what is your recommendation? If that is unchanged after that whole race conversation, that has to remain your position.
Mm.
The piece about you are racist can be handled in another way, but for purposes of medical treatment, if what you have prescribed, if what you have recommended, if what you have said is what is the team's recommendation, is good medicine, has a basis in fact and science, and is directly consistent with this person's need, that's your response. You buy into everything else the moment your sensors say, well, if I don't do it, or they're probably thinking this, you
Right.
set in motion a chain of thoughts that are propelling, self-fulfilling. That's the word I'm looking for, self-fulfilling. And now you are feeling bad. Now you are wondering, should I, that kind of thing. Don't fall into that trap because of the racist structure that may be promoting the sense that maybe there's some truth to this. Keep it medical and take that other conversation to a less conflicted area the next time, or as a side conversation after we resolve this. First, we got to resolve treatment issues, because that's what you're here for.
Right.
And feeling racist, I said at the beginning, feeling that someone thinks you're racist, calls you racist, or believes you to be racist is a part of the work to be done.
Thank you. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness about that.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Sure.
helpful.
There may be others that have additional. I see a couple of faces that may have some other perspectives on that, and weigh in.
Fortunately, we are out of time. For those who would like to continue this conversation, we have shared the link to the after session that Dr. Gordon has organized. So please feel free to join that session if you can. Go ahead, Dr. Stewart.
I was just going to say, I was looking at Dr. Adams. I hadn't looked at the chat, but I see he wrote an example of a response that would be perfect for you, Kim. So thank you, Dr. Adams.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Again, we